Well, good morning, everybody. If you can hear me, hopefully you can hear me, and we'll be commencing the webinar shortly. We're just letting everybody into the session. Georgia, can you see who's on the session? I can't quite see that at the moment.
Yeah, so we have 6 people currently.
Okay, I think we were expecting a few more, so shall we give it a couple of minutes, everybody?
Sounds good.
Thank you. Looks like somebody else has just joined us. So just to confirm, good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Russell. This is the second in our series of innovation briefings. I'll explain in a few moments what those are about. We're just waiting for a couple more people to join us who we're expecting. Okay, Georgia, just going to check with you. For some reason, I can't see who's in attendance, but it looks like there's 8 of us.
Yeah, there should be an attendee drop down. If not, I can read out the names for you.
No, that's okay. I'll say hello to everybody in a bit. If you could maybe look in the background as to why that might be that I can't see the list at the moment. And could you also, Georgia, check the chat box for us, because I'm going to get people to use that. And for some reason, I can only send a chat to organisers and panelists. So something's obviously happening there on the setup, but let's not worry about that. I suggest everybody we carry on. I mean, if you are able to see a chat box, could you just put a comment in that chat box? It should be sort of bottom right hand corner of your control panel, and just say hello, basically, so I know who's here. I suggest in the meantime we crack on. So welcome this morning to what is the second in a series of what we hope will be regular innovation briefings from Oxley. It's part of the Innovation Support for Business programme. I'm really pleased to say we've got much of the same people who attended last week's seminar, the first one, our launch one, our pilot one, and a few other people today. And we're hoping that community of interest will build up over time. The purpose of these briefings is to inform, introduce, raise awareness into what's available to help you innovate in the region of Oxfordshire, share some knowledge between participants, and hopefully start addressing next year issues and things that you'd like to see us address. A few housekeeping notes just for your benefits, and just to make sure you're comfortable with this. We will be recording this. Actually, hopefully Georgia has started recording if you can. And we will make the slides available to everybody in some shape or form after the session. For the moment, we'll keep everybody out. We'll ask you to keep on mute. There's a few more people than there was last week's, but we will invite contributions later on in the session. In the meantime, if you can, use the chat box. I've not seen anything come up, so I think there's something up with my settings. Georgia, can you see any chats appearing?
Yeah, I've got the chats come up. Great. From everyone.
I think we ought to crack on, and I'll worry about another time why I can't see those. It's probably something I've done. But Georgia, if you could bring those chats to my attention if anybody posts some questions or would like me to reiterate anything as I go through, then please do that.
Yeah.
And we'll use the chat at the end of the session. Last week's session, we concluded the main part of business by about 5 to 12. And I was really pleased to say that everybody hung around and were chatting and asking questions, and the debate was going on at least until 12:30. So we'll see what happens today. If you have to leave the session, the main part of the session will absolutely finish by 12 o'clock. And hopefully, if you want to, you can stay on and join in the conversation until about 12:30. So just the last thing to say about these sessions in general is that next year we'll be inviting other people to participate and give a briefing on, for example, what they've got to offer to organisations in the region. So in the future, it won't just be me, but at the moment, it is, I'm afraid, just me. And what I wanted to talk to you today was how can you improve your chances of success when you are making an application for innovation funding. Now, last week's seminar was all about where do we find funding for innovation, primarily grants, but we talked a lot about other sources of funding last week. This week, when you have potentially identified a source of funding for grants, which is a grant sort of type of funding, how do you improve your chances of success? So let's just reiterate that last week. If you want to find out more about what we covered last week, then let us know and we can send you a copy of last week's session. And I think we're also working on a recording of it, which we can publish. This week, how to improve your chances of success. I'm going to cover a few basics and fundamentals, and then I'm also going to talk in a little bit more detail about some concepts which I think are ubiquitous. So they underlying, if you like, for innovation funding applications. And some of them might take a little bit of getting your head around, some of them are quite simple, and we can go into more detail on the more complicated ones, perhaps on a one-to-one basis. And I'll try and conclude with a few elements that I think funding bodies like to see. And that's based on my experience having been a poacher and a gamekeeper in this environment for quite some time. It's not the only thing I do, but applying and getting hold of funding for innovation has been a theme in my work for many years. Just before I go into the first bit about basics and fundamentals, just wanted a few words of context, just again, for the people that were with us last week or the week before last, we're focusing really on SME type funding. Large companies do come into the equation, but the emphasis of what I'm talking about is for small and medium-sized businesses. It's also about funding of innovation projects, not about funding the whole business or everything in the whole business growth and journey. So I want you to be thinking about projects all the way through, and what you define as a project is often, you know, one of the challenging things that you have to get to grips with. So let's move on to basics and fundamentals. Now, these are ones that I just wanted to tick off because they're not actually innovation specific, but they are really important. So I won't go through them in too much detail. I think hopefully they will resonate to you, but I I wanted to get them out of the way in case anybody thought they weren't important for innovation funding as well. Surprising how many people don't answer the question even if they have read it. So different funders will normally give you a template or a questionnaire or an application form to fill in, and there'll be questions, there'll be prompts, and hopefully there'll be guidance as well. You have to pay quite a lot of attention to that guidance and answer the question, even if you think it's a bit of a daft question, potentially. Probably it shouldn't be, but sometimes it appears that way. And even if you think it's repeating stuff which you've already explained, you have to, I would say, your chances of doing a good application are improved if you involve others in the preparation of that application. It might be at the idea stage, it might be at the drafting stage, or a combination of those things. I know that most of you are resource constrained. You don't have massive teams able to help you with this activity and spend loads of time on it. But if you can find innovative ways, if you like, to involve other people just in creative sessions or brainstorming, I think your actual proposal would be likely to be strengthened. Easy for me to say, but leave enough time. We get quite a lot of applications which are clearly a little bit last minute. Would have done with just a few more hours, maybe a couple of days of taking a breather, having a look back at it. Have I answered those questions? Have I really sort of sold my proposition well enough, and can I tweak it accordingly? So leave a little bit of time at the end to do that, and also leave a little bit of time to get somebody fresh to read and review your draft, your application. I can do that for your Go Create Oxlep funding applications. What I'd recommend is that you get somebody who's not involved with the project to read it from cold, because the assessors will be in a similar position. They won't have any knowledge or background, probably. So treat them as somebody who's got to be embraced and explained to from scratch. And the best way to test whether you've done that is to give it to somebody who hasn't got a clue what you're up to. So give them a little bit of time to read it and listen to what they say. You know, have they really understood it? Have they really got their head around what your proposition is? And as the last one, again, this is a little bit motherhood and apple pie for anybody that's done any kind of application. But if you've done any kind of assessment of these applications, then you will really want to make it readable. You want to read things which are interesting and enjoyable to read. So look for ways to enhance that readability. And I'm talking about the use of diagrams, images, graphics, descriptors, storytelling, all that kind of thing. So those are just a few thoughts of mine that are basics and fundamentals, in the sense that they apply to any kind of funding application, let alone, you know, whether it's innovation funding or not. And I wanted to get those out of the way, just so that you realize the context of what we're talking about subsequently. Now I want to talk about innovation funding in particular. And actually, I want to ask you a question, and I would like you to use the chat box. So Georgia, if you're still with us, I hope you are, because I can't seem to see chat, then please use the chat box now. So delegates, please use the chat box to answer this question. Why do we as a nation fund innovation? Just fundamentally, chuck a few thoughts down in the chat box. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Georgia, I think you might have to tell me if we get some contributions.
Yeah, that's fine.
So why does the state provide funding for innovation?
So we have a couple of answers so far.
Great, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Peter has said to earn taxes in the future and create jobs. We also have innovation can help solve new problems that might become more significant later.
Yeah.
To improve the nation's infrastructure and help keep it competitive, as well as we're a pioneering country and innovation is the way we can maintain our position.
So some really good thoughts there. Thank you for that. So there's some good thoughts about, you know, our competitiveness as a nation. Solving problems is one that I will come back to a number of times this morning. I think Peter said something about taxes. Yes, it's about strengthening the economy. That's great. Yeah. So here are my thoughts about why innovation funding in particular. And these are clues. And somebody did actually say this. It's about solving problems generally. It is about creating wealth, new products, new services, opening up new sectors, benefiting from the tax returns, etc. But fundamentally, it's about solving problems. So at the nation level, we often set up programs or funding streams to address these significant major challenges. And I've listed a few there. The most obvious one that we've had this year is, of course, the pandemic. And you would have noticed, like me, the rush of funding that was suddenly found to address these major challenges. And thank goodness for that. So most funding is there to address issues and solve problems. It can be to address issues and solve problems on the micro, the small scale as well. So they can be issues and solve problems in your own businesses or in the markets you deal with. But a lot of funding that we will look at, and we looked at last week, will be addressing these major challenges. So the obvious thing that you have to do in your application is show how your technology, your product, your proposition relates to these challenges. And increasingly, what funders want to see is how you're going to measure the impact that you have on these things. Now, because funding is there for a reason, it's just, you know, we will now look at how that funding comes through in different types and origins of funding programs. But just wanted to reiterate, it's not there because it's nice to have, and it's nice to have some support in place for SMEs that want to do something different. SMEs do need help with innovation, so it's there for that. But it's not there just for altruistic reasons and because we've always had it in the past. I do quite a lot of work with researchers at universities, for example, and some of them are slightly challenged by this. I'm glad that you guys weren't, because they kind of come up with answers like it's there to keep the research base ticking over. It's there to keep researchers employed. And we have to dissuade them of those thoughts pretty quickly. So how does the funding, how does that drive what kind of funding we see offered to us? Well, I just want to start now to propose to you some concepts which might help you understand how to make a good application. And one of them is understanding what the funder is trying to do. And that comes through in two different basic types of funding types or origins. We've got the thematic and the non-thematic programs. So as the slide there says, non-thematic tend to be open to everybody. Well, obviously open to SMEs or some other segment of the business space, for example, or to researchers, but it's open to any ideas. Typically smaller project teams and smaller project sizes, therefore smaller grants. Thematic funding is generally larger in scale, and it is there to achieve a particular reason. So it will have a focus topic, it will have a time scale, it will have generally larger project teams, and it will support larger projects. And what that means to you is don't apply under a thematic scheme if you've got a general technology development. Similarly, don't apply to an open program if you've got quite a specific proposal which fits within one of the themes that the funder is trying to support. Now, in the back of my mind, I've always got Innovate UK. We talked about Innovate UK last week. They have a non-thematic program, which the one we talked about last week is called SMART, but they have a lot of thematic programs which are there to address particular challenges, the kind of challenges that we were talking about a minute ago. So you have to know and pick the right kind of funding type and funder for the kind of activity that you want to do. A good tip is to try and work out what the origin of the funding is, particularly on thematic schemes. So quite likely within a thematic scheme, they will be on, part 3, series 2, program 4. There would have been a history of funding activity in that area. And if you can understand that and respond to it, then you're improving your chances of success. Another way to look at this is, technology inspired versus challenge led. So if you've got a great technology, and we'll talk later on about enabling technologies, which is applicable to a wide variety of situations and applications, and you can't really pick the sector or the theme that it's addressing, or it's quite specific to you, then it's probably a technology-driven, technology push, we used to call it. And thematic is the opposite of that. It's technology pull, where to address particular challenges, the funder is looking to attract innovative proposals to help solve those challenges and doesn't really mind what the technology is that does that. So knowing the funding type and its origins is one of the first things that I want you to think about in terms of how to improve your chances of success. A question that quite often comes up is my project innovative enough? And this is always a tricky one for me because different people have different definitions of innovation, let alone the level of innovation. What we do know, however, is that most funding is not for what I would call incremental innovation. So on my rather clumsy diagram there, you can see a kind of a gradual improvement in performance over time, mainly going in relatively small incremental steps. But at some point around the middle there, there's a bit of a step change, a significant increase in performance, and in a similar sort of smaller space of time. So that's a kind of step change. Now, most funding is there for what they believe are step changing, and I've used some other words there, game changing, disruptive, groundbreaking, and highly significant innovations. You don't see many funding programs or calls for offers of funding where they say we're just quite happy with a modest level of innovation. Funny enough, our Go Create scheme is probably one of the ones which does accept relatively modest levels of innovation by anybody's measure. But if you're going for one of these national schemes, then you have to kind of ask, am I presenting it in such a way that I can persuade people, it comes across that this is significant innovation and not just incremental improvement. So I can't sometimes tell you whether or not something is highly innovative. You will probably say it is. I say it might be, somebody else might say it's not. So it's about argument. It's about making your case for innovation, the level of innovation, and that's really what one of the big challenges in the funding proposal that you're putting together is going to be. So I will move on to some thoughts about how you can make that argument. Just before I do that, let's give an example, just because I like some nice pictures sometimes. Let's have an example of a truly disruptive innovation, a step change, groundbreaking, etc. Not so long ago, most ocean-going yachts of the I'm not a sailor, by the way, so I'll get all this terminology wrong, but most boats, racing yachts, looked like this. Obviously that's quite a pricey one and quite a large one. It's kind of an America's Cup type competitor. But then a few years ago, and it's now beginning to look like the norm, this happened. And we've seen successive incremental innovations of this basic design. And if you're as old as me, you probably will remember when this design came around and it was kept under shrouds, it was hidden, it was highly protective, and it was a real game changer in terms of performance. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have that kind of game-changing innovation to, proposals to make a successful application for funding, but you do have to argue that it's something more than just incremental improvement. Okay, so let's move on to some other concepts which I want you to think about in terms of what underpins a good funding application. And the first one is, it's quite simple. Why do you need the money? And have you explained well enough why you need the money? So what's your rationale? What's your raison d'etre? Now here's a traditional way to think about it. Either you need the money because you have to access skills, knowledge outside of your current competence. And if you're a relatively modest size company, you can reach that point quite quickly. And our Go Create funding is absolutely to address that kind of need. And you similarly might have, a higher level of resource constraints, which is just not allowing you to do these innovations or pursue these projects. Or significantly, you want to go from one domain into a new domain, and this innovation is going to help you give exposure and a position in those new networks or markets or sectors or industries, but you need help to access those markets. So that's why people tend to think about, well, yeah, I need money because, I just haven't got enough cash, or I need help because I just don't know where to find this knowledge. And along with the funding comes some links to networks, etc. But I'd like you to take that thinking a little bit further, because a lot of people don't seem to do this very effectively, articulate why you need the funds. Now, for innovation projects in particular, here's something that I came up with about why we're applying for grant and what's the rationale. It's a little bit Heath Robinson, but bear with me if you don't mind. So on some time scale, on the left-hand side, that's you possibly with your partners, carrying along quite nicely, reasonably successfully, innovating incrementally, and it'll take you from the left-hand side, the right-hand side, point A to point B over a period of time if you continue with your existing activity. But the reason you're applying for grant funding is because you can see some sort of ambitious new future, and it is ambitious. It is a stretch, it is a challenge, and there are challenges to be overcome. Now, if you can address those challenges, then you can unlock that ambitious future, which you can represent in terms of new employment, growth, sales, problem solving, impact on the economy, impact on particular problems or communities, etc., etc. You can measure it. But the reason you need funding is because there are some barriers. Now, I've got here a technical barrier, but in some of the applications we look at, the barrier might be more of a commercial barrier. It might be to do with your business model, or it might be to do with the structure of the industry, or there might be some other kind of combination of barriers which are preventing you and your partners and your team from unlocking that new situation. So the reason you're applying for funding, without wanting to, labour the point too much, is because you need help to overcome those challenges. Now, when you apply to Innovate UK, they want you to have very smart, and I don't mean that as in the scheme, but smart objectives, as in very specific and well thought through innovation objectives. And that's one where I can help, because a lot of the applications I see, the objectives are a bit woolly, a little bit unspecified, not specific enough. And through a kind of a questioning process, I can help strengthen those. And I think it's nice to see, if possible, scientific objectives if they're relevant, definitely technology objectives, maybe commercial objectives as well. So you you group your objectives into different categories to get across to the funder that you really know what you've got to do to get around these problems. Now, I'm anticipating a question that might come up later, is that in an innovation project, you don't often know what the solution is. But the objectives that you set them out here have to be that you have to communicate that you have some ideas what the solution to those barriers might be, and that your proposal is about testing one or more of those and using milestones and decision points, etc., to work out that stage that you then go to next after one particular milestone has been reached. And you might have a choice of direction and a choice of solution, and you narrow that down. But you have to be very specific about that work that you're going to do. But it is about unlocking that ambitious new application. That's why you need the money. Now let's look at another thing which I know that Innovate UK likes. Some of you will know this already as well. Actually, within the audience, I do know that we have some very successful funding applicants. So hopefully they are not going to come on later and say that this was all wrong, and can chuck in some extra ideas. But one other concept which you may not be all of you may not be so familiar with is that of technology readiness levels. This is basically a way that you can show that you are moving from a point A to a point B in terms of your overall journey in bringing a new product or a service or a combination to market. So the original TRLs, if you like, I think were developed by NASA, which is why the ones that I've got descriptors here of are talk about system test, launch, etc. But you could put your own industry specific or technology specific or domain specific measures, and probably a little bit of searching will show you, for example, in medical field or in engineering, what are the typical categories, TRL 1 to TRL 9 or 10, whatever that industry might work towards. Basic technology being at the bottom, and system launch, or very close to the market, being at the top. The point of mentioning this is that you can strengthen your application by saying we will be moving from TRL 4 to TRL 6 through these activities which we're applying for funding. The other point of telling you about technology readiness levels is because some schemes are very specific about what TRL level they want to support. So you can avoid wasting a lot of time by identifying that if it is indeed specified, and saying, well, actually, I'm not in that ballpark. I'm already at TRL 7 or 8. I need to look for some funding which is going to help me with that market readiness activity rather than some research and development activity. I would say Innovate UK open challenge funding is, sorry, open funding, not the challenge funding, is generally around 4, 5, 6, maybe 7. Some people may argue it's nearer, 5, 6, 7. It doesn't really matter if you've got your argument prepared about where you are and how you will move things on. What they're not interested in is you being on TRL 5 at the beginning and at the end of the project, because you haven't really done enough. Yeah, you haven't moved it on. Okay, that's another concept that you'll probably be familiar with again, but again, I believe if you use this concept, it strengthens your application. That's the one around state of the art. Now, I apologize in advance. This is an old slide, which I haven't really updated. It's about, it's an argument, if you like, about state of the art within lighting. So you start down in the 1850s with early gas lamps, and now in the current situation, we're looking at quite sophisticated lighting solutions, OLED, PLED, etc. Now, what innovation funders quite like to see quite often is where you think you are with regard to the state of the art, and are you moving on the state of the art? Now, research funding, by definition, really has to know this very, very sort of well. Researchers in universities or Harwell places like that must have a good understanding of where state of the art exists in the technologies that they're dealing with in the lab. And that's the difference, because you're out in the marketplace. So you might be more interested in state of the art in use in industry at the moment. A good application, though, will be able to identify these various, whether it's lab, whether it's market, where you are in relation to what people use. So if you can put across in your application your understanding, they will appreciate this. Some people will argue actually and say, well, actually they've got that wrong, they haven't really understood it, state of the art is significantly further on than they've appreciated. But sometimes that's okay, because you can say, well, the state of the art in the lab or in a certain industry might be well beyond what I've described, but in my industry, it's actually well behind that. So what I'm going to do is move on the state of the art in the industry that I'm targeting. And a bit like TRL levels, they want to see that you are moving things on. You're making a contribution. You're making a difference. Some of the bigger projects will have quite a lot of weighting given to how you disseminate the knowledge as well as how you commercialize the knowledge. Some of the smaller ones, not quite so worried about that. They don't expect you to go to conferences and things like that, because you'll be basically involved in commercialization and exploitation. But having an understanding of where you fit and being able to argue it is a definite strength, and I hope that domestic lighting example has kind of illustrated it a bit. Nearly the last concept I want to talk about is about positioning. The reason for mentioning this is that if you are addressing a particular problem, your technology is addressing a problem, providing a solution to a challenge or a difficulty, and unlocking potential as a result, one thing to bear in mind is that there's probably other people working on similar things or similar problems, and they may have a different solution. And over the years, the classic one is the video technology. For example, you will remember Betamax and VHS, etc. They were both solutions to a problem, providing an opportunity, massive growth market. But which ones were going to be successful in the marketplace? Different set of factors influencing that. The point of mentioning it here, though, is to be able to communicate which camp you're in is sometimes helpful in a funding application. Not because you can slag off the competition, if you like, and say, yeah, I'm in camp B with this, and camp B is responding to this call, but camp C has got it completely wrong and they don't know what they're talking about. It's better to be positive and say, we believe the solution is in this field, this area, but we will address, we are aware that other people have different ideas about this, and we'll embrace that and address it if we can. Now, this one is probably a step too far for a lot of your applications, but I thought it would be an interesting one to table with you, because I think if you are interested in taking part in some of those bigger programs, and I think we do have a couple of people that are involved in bigger programs, then knowing which camp you're in can be quite helpful as you progress through different funding opportunities. It also might help you address the fact that your application may be assessed by somebody who sits in a different camp, and being able to sort of anticipate that and mitigate against what they might say will probably increase your chances of scoring more highly. So let's have a look at a few specifics about what Innovate UK like to see in applications to their innovation funding schemes. And I've been to a number of their presentations over the years, not recently, obviously, and they use this interesting acronym, ERICA. E is about enabling, and enabling technology, as hopefully you know, is an invention or an innovation that can drive change across a range of application areas or industries. They're typically they're typically fast developing areas that are going to open up lots of different opportunities. Your funding application might be about opening up an opportunity in a particular area, but the technology hopefully applies to other areas as well. And Innovate UK tend to like those. Now, you may not be sure whether what you've got is technically an enabling technology. I'm saying to you, make the argument that it is or could be. Address the fact that they like enabling technologies and they like game changing, as we talked before, and they like disruptive innovation. There is a little bit of a game here to be playing about giving them what they want, and that's the same as any kind of funding application, I would argue. They want to see a good assessment of risk, and I can help with developing risk tables and mitigation, developing mitigation strategies. It's a funny one because innovation projects, yes, have risk inherent in them, but they want to see you minimizing that as far as possible. Sometimes to the point where it's kind of annoying because they don't want to take any risks themselves, even though there's an uncertain future for what you're trying to do. But addressing the fact through risk analysis is something which they like to see and strengthens your application. Innovation levels, we've talked about before. Innovate UK in particular is very much about commercial application and having lots of evidence about the opportunity which you're addressing. Additionality, the final letter in the acronym, is a little bit more vague, but it's basically how is Innovate UK making a difference to what you're trying to do? So it's a kind of a bit of an ego thing. How does your project solve problems and provide additionality to the field that you're working in, and how does Innovate UK provide additionality? How does their funding take you over the edge, if you like, unlock things which other sources of funding haven't managed to do? And how does Innovate UK funding build on the other sources of funding or effort that you've been making? They don't see their funding as core to get you started, really. It's to build on something which you've probably invested in yourself already. Now, the final points on this slide are ones that that I think you have to allow yourself time to go back over and address in your application. No non sequiturs. So a lot of people make claims or conclusions that don't follow from, you know, their original premise, and that's kind of really annoying when you read it. They also, lots of applications are prone to exaggeration, hyperbole, and also motherhood and apple pie type statements. So if you can remove those as an assessor, it greatly strengthens. It may mean that you feel like you haven't made an obvious point, but too many people put down things without being able to back them up, without showing the sources of the data that they're building their claims on, etc., etc. And that really weakens an application, as does too much motherhood and apple pie. Bear in mind that, particularly like with Innovate UK, they get hundreds of applications, so they really don't like the ones with unsubstantiated claims in them. So a few last remaining thoughts before we go to a bit of a Q&A, hopefully. They are taking a risk with you, so your job is to persuade them to trust you. How do you do that? Persuasion is a process, I would argue, and your application is quite often your only chance to do that. And the process, I believe, is reflected by this this diagram by Bullinger, but it starts at the bottom, if you like. So the first thing you have to do is make sure they understand what you're doing, what your proposal is. Don't make them struggle for that basic understanding. Once you've got that basic understanding from clear descriptions, make them care. There are different techniques that we can use to make them care, get them to imagine things, get them to picture things, get them to believe that what you're doing is worthwhile, and then get them to agree with it, get their buy-in. Then the next thing, obviously, you want to do is make your application as memorable as possible, because after they've done your assessment, they've probably got another 50 to do, and they've done a ranking and they've done a scoring, but something hopefully has stuck in their mind, something that you've put in your application. Might be a great descriptor, might be a great diagram, might be some quotes from potential users or customers, etc., and it helps them remember it. So this is a sales process, as you know, and obviously it ends here with the product or the service being used by the customer. Obviously, what you're trying to do is persuade the assessors in a similar sort of process to release or recommend some funding to you, but it's a sales process at the heart. So in summary, I've just tried to understand the funding body. We've talked about the importance of very strong and relevant ideas addressing problems and good, clear presentation. So just go back at the end and say, have I done these basic things? And I won't go through this one in great detail, but we can help you with this. Too many people jump from one funding source to another, and they put a lot of effort into inappropriate funders and end up being driven by the funding rather than driven by the company need. So good planning and taking a long-term view sort of helps to do that. But I realise these are easy things for me to say and not quite so easy things to implement, but hopefully we can help with that. And yeah, I'm here to help people develop your own roadmap and look at the validity of sources. I can't generally do the searching for you, as we talked about last week, don't have the time. But if you find something, then I'll look at it with you and say, yeah, I think actually it is worth an application. And last week we talked about being creative about where you look for those applications. It may not be in your original domain area. It might be because actually your enabling technology is addressing some other problems as well. So, okay, a word from our sponsor. We have a couple of another initiatives that will help you, not least our Go Create funding, which is talked about there, and I would talk to most of you about. I'm happy to do so more so. Still open for applications. And we also have a few remaining places on our peer networks, not directly related to innovation or funding, but very helpful, very powerful mechanism for business development. If you're interested in our peer networks, have a look on the web. You'll get these slides afterwards. As I said, there are a few places remaining, but not many, I understand, which is great. And my final slide there is a contact point. You don't have to take that down now because you'll get these slides afterwards, but I hope you have found that presentation of use.